Deer tallow might be the #1 thing that gets discarded after a hunt that really breaks our heart because it is so useful. It's kind of gained a bad reputation among hunters who have tried cooking with it because it has a hard, waxy texture at room temperature that can feel a little unpleasant on the mouth. And while we think it does have some good applications in cooking, what we're talking about today is why you should absolutely render your deer tallow for use in skincare. Deer tallow is a really great ingredient for skincare for a number of reasons. It's full of vitamins and minerals, and the fat makeup of deer tallow is pretty similar to our skin's own oil makeup, so it rubs in really easily, and it's actually often advised for people with conditions like eczema and acne to try using out tallow products. The process of rendering deer tallow is very simple and straightforward. Now, the amount of tallow you'll get from an animal is really variable. Last year, Jordan got a buck that had hardly any tallow on it, probably wouldn't have made it through the winter. And then this year, we hit the mother load. This is like half of the tallow that we got off of one deer this year. But first, what you want to do is clean it up as best you can of the little bits of meat. When you're butchering the animal, it's very easy to identify the tallow by the fact that it's white, it's waxy, and it kind of can be pulled right off the animal in these like thick sheets. But what we want to do is expose more surface area on the tallow before we put it in the slow cooker with some water to render it down. If you don't have time to render your tallow right after butchering the deer, which is understandable because that's a lot of work, you want to go ahead and put your tallow in the freezer because when it's unrendered like this, it's not shelf stable and it will oxidize very quickly and start smelling off, and you just don't want that to happen. So we just put it in Ziploc freezer bags until we're ready to process it. Once it is rendered and totally purified, it is actually shelf stable indefinitely. Today, we're going to do the wet method of rendering tallow, which is better for applications in skincare because it results in a really consistent purified product that doesn't smell at all and again is very shelf stable. Now, if you have a meat grinder, you can actually just run the tallow right through that. It should be chilled and it'll come out in, nice tiny little cubes or tiny little cylinders to go into the render pot. We don't have one of those, so we're just cutting it up small, but I'm gonna show you later how you can get it even smaller and really get every last bit of tallow from your deer. As you're chopping into your tallow, if you come across something like this is actually a gland. Deer have glands, scent glands throughout their body, and they're often found in these fat deposits. So this will have some off scents or flavors, so you definitely want to cut around that and not put that into your mix when you're rendering. Now that we have our deer tallow roughly chopped, we're going to get it going in the slow cooker with some water and some salt. This is just sea salt that we actually made from the ocean when we were on vacation a year ago. And the reason we put this in is it just kind of helps pull out some of those impurities within the tallow and you can just skim them off. And we're also going to add water. This is going to keep the tallow from getting stuck on the bottom and burning. And because the tallow is a fat and the water is water, they don't mix, and it makes it a lot easier to separate out the tallow once things cool down. We're getting this going in the slow cooker. It's going to take several hours, probably a full day, to fully render out the tallow. You could definitely do this on the stove top. You'll just want to check on it more often to make sure that your water's not evaporating and your tallow's not burning, and just stir it every now and then. But we're going to get this going and come back in a couple hours once the tallow has gotten nice and soft. Our tallow and water solution has been going for several hours in the slow cooker, and I'm just looking to see that it's nice and tender. You can see these little blobs are really squishy. So what I'm gonna do now is actually blend it up. And this is because we didn't put it through a meat grinder earlier. So we just wanna blend it so that all of that surface area is exposed and we can get the most actual rendered tallow out of what we have here. Okay, so that is nicely blended up. It's not the most appetizing looking thing in the world, but it's not done yet. I'm gonna let this go actually overnight since it's getting late already, and then the next morning we will go ahead and strain this out and show you what we're working with. Okay, so it's the next day. This has been going overnight, and you can see that the solids have really shrunken up because the gristle has released the tallow and it's all rendered out. And now we're going to do our first straining. All right, so all this beautiful glossy pale yellow stuff on top is the tallow, and we're going to just pour it through a few layers of cheesecloth and then let it settle out. Okay, now I'm just gonna lift it up. I have it in a colander here just to kind of keep it secured. And I'm just gonna lift it up so that all of the solids can be kept separate from the liquid. Now that we've gotten all of the solids out, because the tallow is solid at room temperature, we're just gonna let this sit and cool down, and the tallow will separate out from the water, and we'll see how much purification we got or if we need to render it out one more time. Okay, so you can see that the tallow has set up really nicely. It is solid. And the amount of time it takes for it to do that really just depends on how cold it is in your house. You can always stick it in the fridge if you want it to go even faster. So now we're gonna get it out of here. There's probably some water underneath. So we're gonna dry it off because you don't want it to be wet because that can make it go bad. And also just see how purified it is. All right. Oh yeah, beautiful. So you can see right here, this is where kind of like the salt helps draw out a lot of the grit and impurities that were in the tallow. So I just kind of want to scrape that off. It actually looks remarkably clean. Other batches we've done have had like a dark discoloration here, and you can kind of see like little funky bits of dirt and meat and stuff like that. But this was a really clean batch going in, so it's going to take less to clean it off. But I'm just going to scrape it. And then another thing you can do is just kind of look at the cross section here, and you can see it's really like pure white all the way through. Also, it really doesn't smell. A lot of times, the first batch, it still kind of smells a little gamey, I guess, or just kind of deery. Not a terrible smell, maybe good if you want to use it for soap for hunting or something like that. But obviously, depending on the product we're making with it, we want it to be odorless. So that's another thing you can check for. So I think this is actually good to go. If I felt like it needed more purification, I would just redo that process, but it would go much faster because we don't have to get all of the gristle and like fat solids out. We would just remelt it with some more salt and then pour it back into a bowl and let it solidify and scrape it down again. But I think we're good to go on this. I'm just gonna put it in little blocks, make sure it's thoroughly dried off, and then store it in these jars right here. In that big block of tallow, there were still some pockets of moisture. So to get rid of those and make it truly shelf stable, we just remelted it, this time without adding any additional water. Now that it's remelted, because it's a fat, it's gonna sit on top of any of that residual water. And so we're just gonna pour it off the top layer into some mason jars. So there'll be no moisture in there, and then we can just store it shelf stable indefinitely. Our tallow has solidified beautifully in these mason jars. You can see it is pure white, it is odorless, it is ready to just sit on the shelf until we're ready to use it, which, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, there are so many uses for deer tallow once it's been rendered out like this. You can process it with lye to make soap. It's a really rich, creamy soap. You can use it to condition things like leather boots or tools. You can use it in cooking, and we're going to get into that in some videos down the line, so just stay tuned for that. And I highly recommend, if you're lucky enough to get a deer that has some fat, don't waste it because it is a really useful and wonderful material.